Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Freeing Your Mind podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Dukeman, and this week I have with me Heather Olsen. I've known Heather for several years now. She's actually my therapist and was gracious enough to come on and join and talk about what she does and how she helps people that are struggling with mental health. So, how are you, Heather?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing good, thanks.
Good.
So we'll just do what we do. We dive right in, and I'll have you tell everybody about yourself, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay. Um, so I am a licensed clinical social worker. That means I have a master's degree in social work. I got my undergrad degree in social work from Utah State University, and then I got my graduate degree in social work from the University of Utah. I started out working with a domestic violence and rape crisis center. And was there for about 6 years in a variety of capacities. And then I did substance abuse counseling for a year. And then I went to residential treatment for adolescent girls until I was able to start my own practice in 2017. I work with a variety of people and a variety of issues, though I specialize in trauma and even more specifically in treating attachment trauma.
Okay, so when you say attachment trauma, what do you mean by attachment trauma?
Great question. So, our relationships with the people who raised us, our primary caregivers, whoever those people are shaping the way that we see ourselves in relationship to others and the way that we identify ourselves in the relationship with others, the way that we perceive the world around us and how we fit into that. So everything that our parents do for us in terms of how they parent, how they respond to us when we're hurt, how they respond to us when we've had an achievement or we've done something big that they want to reward us for, how they show love, how they apply discipline, impacts then us and our own development. And so we take with us generationally then all these things that we have developed based on how we were parented. And our parents brought that to us based on how they were parented. And that's how generational trauma can move from generation to generation to generation. If you have a parent who has PTSD, say that you had a parent who was in the Vietnam War and has PTSD. That's the context in which you were raised, with a parent who is going to be highly reactive because their system is in a state of hyperarousal or fight or flight response just about all the time. And they can be triggered so that it's even more extreme. And then they have those big reactions that you kind of hear about, maybe the dissociation. Mostly, though, you'll see a lot of anger. There can be a lot of drug addiction and alcoholism that they're using to cope. But all of those things are then influencing us and our development. So if we have a parent who we kind of never know what their mood is going to be or how they're going to react to something, we become an anxious person. And we start to develop an anxious attachment style that we're then going to take into our relationships, where we are anxious about how things are going, how our partner is perceiving us, or even in friendships, how other people are perceiving us. We're anxious about maybe making a mistake or being left. Or maybe we've developed an avoidant attachment style because our parents really weren't very present for us. So we really weren't seen or heard as a kid, in which case then we're going to struggle in relationships because we are not going to be able to really open up and let people in to really form relationships, or to the degree that we would need to really have a healthy relationship. And then we're taking all of that with us into how we parent our own kids, right? So therein lies attachment trauma and what can happen. And it happens, I mean, as parents, we screw up all the time. I screw up all the time. I have two kids. And it's not about never making mistakes. It's about what we do after the mistake. And it's about what we're doing in general and how we're seeing our kids and hearing our kids and trying to understand them and relate to them and provide a safe space for them, so that they can then have a secure attachment and take that into their parenting style. That's all to say that's very specific level of trauma, but it really relates to all of us because we all have probably some attachment wounds from growing up. Mm-hmm. But then there's the trauma that comes from all the other things that can happen in life as well. And I treat that trauma as well.
Yeah, and that was how our paths crossed. I don't know, what was 5 years ago, 6 years ago? I don't remember anymore. I feel like sometimes I just make the number up in my head because it's been a long path, a long journey to get to where we are today. And so some of the things that I know you do, like I know you do EMDR treatment. We did that for a number of years. Can you explain a little bit about what that is and how that works, and then maybe talk about some of the other stuff that you do treatment wise?
Yes. So EMDR, if you've never experienced it, you don't know what it is, you hear about it, probably sounds like voodoo, which I don't know how you felt about it, Dan, when I'm like, hey, we're going to do this thing and here's how it goes. I mean, what did you think when I'm talking about this?
So as you explained it to me, I was just kind of like, and I was in a pretty bad space. Like I didn't care if I walked out of there and got hit by a truck. Like, didn't matter to me. Didn't care about life. But it was very much just like, okay, that sounds weird. I don't really understand it. It doesn't seem like it would do anything. And the best that I could explain it was I just almost felt like I was like almost in a trance a little bit from it.
Yes.
A hypnotic state, so to speak.
Yes. And so in that way, it kind of activates our mind, not the same way that hypnotherapy might, but it is allowing us to be very present with ourselves. EMDR is a modality for treating trauma. It's probably the most highly researched modality for treating trauma. So it's kind of was the gold standard. And of course, then there has been lots of development and things beyond there, and even modalities that are kind of an offshoot as people learn more and more about it. EMDR was developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro, and it was one of those things where an intervention and understanding that you kind of stumble upon by accident. And what she realized is that the movement of her eyes as she was thinking through stressors, what she wasn't doing on purpose, she was going for a walk in a place where she's walked a lot, and she's thinking through stressors and just kind of looking back and forth at the different things in the park as she's going, and realized that somehow that time when she walked, she came to this place where things kind of felt more organized and calm, like she had kind of worked through something and she can figure out, like, why is this different? Why is this different than every other time I've done this when I'm stressed? And that's when she started to realize maybe the only difference is in analyzing it was just the eye movement pattern. So it was studied then and originally developed with eye movement. So essentially a therapist would be sitting across from their client, but slightly to the side, and they would hold their fingers up and they would move them back and forth, and the client would just follow their fingers. If they're not moving their head and the stimuli, the therapist's fingers were just the right amount in front of the client's face, and they were only following with their eyes, what happens is the sides of your brain that are picking up the signal switch. So when you were looking over here, her left brain was doing the controlling. And then when it went over here, right brain was doing the controlling. And so now it's been developed where we don't just necessarily have to do the finger thing. I've never done that with you. It makes my arm really tired. And doing EMDR myself, in it, processing these super vulnerable things, I was not comfortable sitting with somebody that close to me at all. So I preferred to use what we sometimes call the tappers, the pulsers. There's no really standard name. We just all call it whatever. And which I've done with you. So you're holding these little round devices in your hand, and they actually just vibrate, and they just alternate vibration. You can adjust the speed and the intensity of the vibration to whatever just feels right for the person. But by doing that, what we're doing is we are trying to keep the a part of your brain present in the process, because what happens with trauma is when our fight or flight response is activated, it's activating systems within the midbrain. Midbrain takes control, and our frontal brain, which is all of our higher functioning, all of our processing, makes sense, think of things rationally, file them away into long-term memory storage. All of that gets shut off. Mm-hmm. So then everything that we just experienced in this trauma, when sometimes it gets trapped in that trauma center. Our brain can't process it, even though it knows exactly what it needs to do. Hence the nightmares and things like that our brain keeps trying to send forward, but that's just not going to do it either, because even in a nightmare, we get activated, right? Yep. When we use bilateral stimulation, which simply means applying some sort of stimulus to opposite sides of our body and just switching it back and forth, it actually keeps this front part of our brain active so that it can stay, even though we're feeling some distress as we process, it can stay a part of the process, and our brain can do exactly what it's built to do, which is process information, help us to have a realistic timeline so that our brain literally organizes it from that was then, this is now, I remember back then, I remember what I felt and what happened, but when I think about it right now, or when something makes me think about it right now, it doesn't cause me to feel this extreme distress like it's happening again in this moment, right? Your brain organizes it and stores it away in long-term memory. So you get some healing. So all these things aren't triggering you anymore, so that you feel like you're crazy and you feel like things are out of your control and you're pissed off all the time and you don't really know why. And every little thing you're snapping at your kids or other people in your life, or you're struggling to be sober because there's so much distress, or sleep at night, things like that. You're getting some healing and integration so that it is no longer locked in the trauma space, which allows your brain to then not be activated every time something that's the memory of it is experienced.
And just to be clear, when we started this process, all those things that you mentioned about anger all the time, struggling to be sober, not sleeping, lashing out at family, kids, you name it, that was me. And that was very much where I was when we started this process. And over time we did gain some ground by working through some of the traumas. And I do remember we sat down and made a list, which was like probably harder than doing the actual treatment. Yes. Because it was just like, okay, well, there was this one thing, there was this kid that drowned, there was this really bad accident, there was on and on and on, all these things. But what was fascinating to me was, as we went through the process dealing with these different traumas one at a time, and sometimes it was multiple sessions with each trauma, that suddenly I'd just be like, I just remembered this event and this one, and other things would resurface as we were kind of peeling back these layers and dealing with them, that other things resurfaced, which was always fascinating to me, because I still occasionally experience that randomly, that just something will come to mind and you're like, wow, how did that just, it was buried for so long and I didn't even know it was there.
Yes. And yet some of those things can then come to mind. We've done so much work. There's so much healing and integration that now when some of those things come up, it's because your brain is just doing its natural process and something prompts it to remember that. But if we had worked through some of the trauma that had been associated with, even if we didn't work on that directly, notice then it's just the memory of that thing versus I just remember this and now I feel extreme distress in some way, anger, shame, fear, anything that feels terrible. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's definitely been the case where stuff's come up. I was actually recording at an episode with Eric Portwood that you guys may have seen, that we were talking about PTSD and traumatic events like we always do. And he had mentioned a call that specifically bothered him. And all of a sudden I just came to the forefront of my mind. Like, I didn't even remember about this. And it was, almost 20 years ago. And my initial thought was just, I was more shocked and stunned that it came up and that I hadn't remembered it, because it was such a significant event in my life at the time. But that was the shock of it all, was just that, well, where'd that come from? But it wasn't the feeling of just that the anxiety and just being overwhelmed, and that it was the fight or flight type feeling that
Yes. And
that I didn't been in
you brought
before.
up a good point. Sorry, I totally
Yeah.
interrupted.
No, you're
You
good.
brought up a good point there too, though, where the person you were talking to is bringing this up, and for them, it was locked into that trauma system. It got stuck.
Mm.
For you, at the time that that memory was brought back to your conscious awareness, it was not locked in that trauma space. And therein lies some of the complexity of trauma. And sometimes where we think like, well, I don't really have any trauma. I don't know what's wrong with me. Like, I'm a crappy person. I'm a terrible dad. I'm a terrible whatever. When really these things impact us, and we don't get to choose which things are going to get locked in this trauma center and we're going to get stuck in this loop, and which things we're going to be able to work through. Right. So it's not always the big things that everybody suspects a trauma is going to be. There are lots of little things, we call those little t traumas, that one person it might get stuck and another person it doesn't. Right. Yes.
Yep, definitely.
People always ask me too, and I'm talking about EMDR and or hypnotherapy. I'm not even sure I remember things like, and I try to remind them, tell them like, it's okay. Your brain is going to choose, not even choose. It's going to send through what it needs you to be aware of and what it doesn't. And you have to trust that your brain knows exactly what it's doing. So if your subconscious doesn't ever help you remember something that you know kind of happened, but you're not really sure what, that's okay. It determines that that isn't even necessary for you in this process to heal. Likewise, you might not even remember things that you don't even know you don't remember. And that's okay too. There can still be healing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is just a fascinating thing because I never really understood. I guess I didn't really even fathom how much the brain does that until we started unraveling everything. And then just as I've continued this journey and gone into different treatments and tried other things, it's always amazing what else comes out of it. And just the little bits of growth and just clarity, things that get processed that you didn't know were there, or that at least now they're not in that full-blown panic mode. But when they come up, you're just like, okay, and just deal with it and then move on in a very, very productive way, instead of the just shut down the world type of way that it
right. That's your brain doing exactly what it knows how to do, that in that moment it was still capable of doing on its own. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's actually great that you have used so many different treatment interventions, because there is no like one intervention that is, I mean, I said this is kind of the gold star, but by that I mean it's the one that's the most researched, that's had the most information about it, that shows just how well it works, right? But that doesn't mean it's the only thing. And I have had clients where EMDR just was not something we could do, but hypnotherapy, they responded excellently to. Or some I've had where we can't even get to where we need to get to be able to even process, where I've referred them to ketamine treatments to hopefully be able to do some of the work that allows them there, right? That it's all just about trying these things. And it's so hard when you're in a state of trauma, when you've got PTSD or just some really active trauma happening in your life at that time. It is really hard to get help. It's really hard to keep going. And it's really hard when one doesn't quite do it for you to feel like you've got the energy or the hope to try another one.
And I had certainly gotten to that point with you where there was a period in all this where I was really just going through the motions because I hadn't really built the rapport with you yet. Like we were just trying to develop the relationship so that I was more willing to be open and vulnerable, because that's the other hard thing. Like just making the phone call that saying, hey, I'm messed up. It's hard enough. But then you're going to meet with a complete stranger who's like, tell me your deepest, darkest secrets. Like, and nobody wants to do that. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And 9 times out of 10, or maybe 10 times out of 10, trauma, one of the emotions that I find is always a part of it is shame,
Mhm.
regardless of the trauma. And some of them
Yes.
will carry a lot more shame than others. So now we have to call somebody and be like, I am screwed up. I need help. I'm freaking out. And then we have to go talk to this stranger about the things that we feel shame about.
Mhm.
That's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying.
Yep. And once we did work through that, eventually we kind of got to the point where I became more comfortable with you. And of course I was seeing you, I think once or twice a week initially,
Uh-huh.
and we stayed
Mm-hmm.
on the once a week for a long time. And
Yeah.
then we did start to make a lot of progress. And I did feel married to the EMDR treatment for a long time. And it wasn't until it's probably been about like 2.5 years now that
Mm-hmm.
I had dealt with an infant drowning, and it was really bad, but I wanted to be proactive. So I called right away. Like it happened on a Saturday morning. I think I called Saturday afternoon. It was like, hey, I need to make an appointment. So I got an
Yeah.
appointment. I think I got in Monday afternoon, and I was just like gung ho, like I'm gonna hit this thing head on and deal with it. I'm not gonna bury it, not gonna repress it. And we just dove right in, and we're dealing with that trauma. And what kept happening was I just couldn't get quite past it. I'd get like up here where I was starting to feel good, and I'd plateau, and then it just fall again. And then anytime something else just mildly traumatic or that my brain perceived to be traumatic would trigger it again. And I had talked to you about just, hey, I this isn't working. I don't know what to do because
Mm-hmm.
we're just plateauing. I'm not getting past this point
Yeah.
where I want to be a 10 and I'm only a 7. And that was when you had recommended looking into the ketamine treatment. And at the time, it was new to our area, and it's still a
Uh-huh.
fairly new treatment. And um, I really felt like at the state that I was in, and as much time as an effort that we had put into the EMDR, and it had gotten me very far, I'd come a long ways.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
knowing that it wasn't getting me any farther, that was another option, and to at least
Yeah.
try it, because honestly I felt like, what did I have to lose? If
Yes.
I didn't feel like I wanted to live, if I was back to that state, then if what the tool I'm using isn't working, then get a new tool.
Right.
And that was when we dove into ketamine, and those treatments were always backed up the next day with an appointment with Heather. And so we just continue this process of go do the ketamine treatment, and then we would essentially just talk about the treatment and kind of what came of it and work on the integration, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. And sometimes that's what it takes. It takes a combination of things or just something totally different. And I do think that I can't even imagine what it would have been like for you if you had not done all of that work before you had to respond to that call.
Mhm.
Like how you would have been able to survive that one, because that one hit real hard.
Yeah, as bad as that was, as quick as that was, it yeah, I don't even know if I would have made the choice to keep living if I had done treatment prior to or before that call. Um, but definitely when that one hit so hard, and I knew it was gonna hit hard. Like it was still in that initial phase where when you experience the trauma initially and you know it's there, you know what happened and it's real, but your brain's still attempting to process it as it's also fresh and raw. So I knew it
Yes.
was gonna get worse. And I was working really hard to try to not start drinking heavily and not do any of these things. And I still really hadn't like curbed my alcohol use that much before that, but it just kept spilling over into everything. And I think that had I not done that, like you said, it would have been much, much worse.
Right. Yeah. That's one
And
of those life-changing calls.
yeah. And
Yeah.
really it's one of those ones, especially once you have kids, it changes everything,
Yes.
your perspective on it.
Absolutely.
Because I just certainly remember I got home, and I couldn't say a word to my kids without just I felt like I was just going to lose it and just start crying and bawling. And I just
Yeah.
hugged them. And of course then I started crying, but the emotion was so powerful there because I mean, somebody never gets to hold their kid again, and I came
Right.
home to mine. And so I was very much appreciative of being able to come home to my kids. But yeah, it's a game changer for your world for sure. And then to want to deal with it as much as I did and was struggling to figure out how to deal with it
Yes.
was an interesting thing as well.
Knowing, I think you had the benefit at that point of knowing that there is help. Like it can, you can get some healing. It's not going to get stuck there. Even though it was plateauing and things like that, you would have the benefit of seeing um how you could get a lot of healing before that, right? So it
Mhm.
gave you probably a little more energy um to keep going, and it gave you the awareness to even recognize where it was at and how it was affecting you and where it was probably going to go,
Mhm.
which is part of the process. When you're in therapy, you're learning these things about yourself.
Mhm.
um so then it allows you, when more stuff happens, because life happens, when there are other things in our life that are traumatic, now we've got some knowledge to rely on. Our brain's gonna say, oh, here's what's happening. When this happens, it tends to go like this. I don't want to feel that way. What are my options? But it also feels like there are options, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Before help, it feels like there is no option.
No, it was
And
go
or
Drew, go
whatever
Drew.
options are there, you feel like there's no guarantee. And can I even do that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think so much of it is just the tool that you start with is what's building that foundation.
Yeah.
And then learning a lot of the other things because we'd even tried like some meditation type stuff, visualizations. And at the time, like that just really didn't
Yep.
like we did some exercises in your office and like okay, like I get it, but like I could never integrate that in. And it wasn't until much later, probably just
Yeah.
really about 8 months ago was when I actually
Yes.
was able to start meditating regularly and actually find value in it to where I could actually get into a space where I could do it. And that was something that was kind of pushed by my girlfriend that she's like, no, you got to try this. Like you got to do it. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't work. But once I had developed so much along the way with these other
Uh-huh.
tools, that allowed that tool to become effective.
Right. And it allowed it to become an option.
Yes.
Maybe even in the beginning, it didn't feel even plausible as an option, right? Because it might have seemed silly or weird. Like, how can these guided meditations or creating these spaces in my mind so that it calms my body down? Like, how really, like, is this more woo woo stuff, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
And
maybe just weren't ready at that point to be open enough to even accept it, which is
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And I tell people all the time that I work with that it is very much, here's this toolbox full of tools. Some of these we're just going to set aside because you're going to say that's BS. It's not going to do anything for me. And
Uh-huh.
then there's going to be a few that you're like, well, that might. And then we just try it. And then you evaluate as you go if they're working for you or not. And
Right.
and that was one of the things that got me into to trying other things after I mean, what I guess see last June was about a year of ketamine ish
Mhm.
and then just coming into that end of that year in the fall was when I really started to experience other things like breath work and the meditation and then just really seeking out other things that were available to me because I wanted to be able to speak on a level of intelligence about them, but I also wanted to really dig deeper into myself and see if initially I thought I was good. And it wasn't until the first time I did breath work. And, I was still doing the
Mhm.
ketamine treatments just to follow the protocol and spreading them out. But once I did breath work and I was like, wow, that unearthed some things. And I remember talking to you about that too. And I remember leaving there going like, well, what the heck? Like, and then so then my response was like, well, if I can keep unearthing stuff, let's get a bigger shovel and then let's
Right.
keep going.
right?
so we did more breath work and then got into meditation and different types of meditation and anything that I can find now
Yep.
because I want to be able to know all about these things. It's become quite a passion to be able to speak on them from a level of intelligence and then just to be able to recommend them to people. And uh, there's still stuff out there that I haven't gotten to yet, but I think because there's so much out there now, uh, once people know they're available, it gives them a greater option for
Right.
treatment versus just thinking, because I just thought I was gonna sit on like it's like the movies, right? I just thought I'm gonna lay on a couch for an hour and just talk, or you're gonna
Right.
talk, and you know, I didn't know what to expect.
Sure. Yep. Yep. Can you imagine if you had come to my office first and I was like, okay, we're going to lay on the floor and I'm going to turn the lights off and I'm going to turn on some music and we're going to breathe pretty much to the point of hyperventilation. And
Yes.
you're going to have these amazing breakthroughs, right? You would have been like, you are batshit crazy.
Yeah,
I'm leaving,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, I'm
Right.
out. I'm gonna go drink.
Yes, but then when you get to that point where I don't know what it is for us, maybe enough ego strength or something to be like, okay, I'll try this weird hippie thing
Mhm.
or whatever it seems like, right? Um, even though it seems bizarre, and then you have these incredible experiences, right? But something that it does take courage even to do that, even though that seems far less scary to me because I'm not going into a stranger and talking about any of this stuff, right? This is all inside of me, but it still seems weird and embarrassing. Like I can't tell people I'm going to a breathwork session. Like they're going to ask what it is, and I'm going to be so embarrassed. They're going to think I'm weird, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
but
and I would have been when we started out for
yes,
sure. Now I'm like, hey
yes,
guys, guess what I did?
yeah. And I took my kids, and
Yep,
yes,
exactly.
yes. There is so much growth to be made, but it takes so much courage to reach out and to be willing to essentially take a giant leap of faith when some strangers like, okay, here's what we're going to do, and I promise that things can be different for you.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that just start somewhere.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what I
Whatever
ended up
that is.
doing. And
Yep.
and that was kind of the big thing behind it too. I mean, I could have gone after the first appointment with you, I could have gone and talked to somebody else and just
Yeah.
got another opinion of like treatment. But at that point, I was already like, I didn't want to talk to you about it. I didn't want to
I
open
don't
up
want to go to somewhere
the little
else.
bit that I
Yeah.
did. Now I'm not going to go do it again. So I'm like, well, I did this work right here. This is where I'm at. I'm not going to go talk to anybody else. Like it's bad enough. I got to talk to one person. At least that was how I felt at the time. Not
Yes.
realizing that
Yeah.
just in the act of talking is very liberating and therapeutic
Yeah.
once you become comfortable doing it.
Yes. Yes. And that is the key. That is actually the greatest predictor of success with therapy specifically, is the client therapist relationship.
Mm,
So it's imperative if you're going to process trauma, it is imperative that it is an environment where you feel safe and you feel um, like you're not going to be judged, where you feel like it's safe to tell these things that feel so, to talk about these things to whatever degree that feel so shameful or that are so difficult for you.
mm,
Um, because that's what it takes in order to get the healing. And so it's really important that to have that sense of safety and trust, in which case sometimes the first therapist you go to is just not the right fit.
mm,
There's no like standard check boxes. You just kind of know what you know, and that's okay. It's okay if somebody came to me and then they said, you know what, I feel like I need to try some other therapists. I would say absolutely you should do that,
mm,
because um it's not going to hurt my feelings. My whole job is to help them,
mm.
and if they don't feel like I'm right for them, then it's not going to help. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And with that, I mean, you said there's no hard and fast. I'm just out of curiosity because I've had some people that I've talked to that have run into that where they're like, yeah, I've been seeing this person, but we didn't really jive, or just there wasn't common ground, or I felt like they wanted to just talk about like how they knew somebody where I lived type of thing. And I very much understood that that's probably that individual trying to create some common ground and rapport.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
do you think that there's a number of times that someone should like go in and have an appointment before they decide this person's not for me? Like, or is it just can it be a one and done and you know?
I'm thinking about myself and I'm thinking there are times where probably I feel like it could be a one and done and I would feel comfort. I would feel like I wasn't just running away. And there were times where I'd feel like I probably need to try 2 or 3 times just to see, if I feel offended by what somebody said, or if I feel like they just really did not hear me, or what they did hear, they totally just said something that clearly they weren't really seeing me
Mhm.
for me, because whatever they said was so exceptionally judgmental feeling or offensive. If it rubs you that way, probably go to a different one, just because even if that wasn't their intention, and even if maybe later a bond could be built, now you're kind of starting off maybe from a little bit of a negative. And
Mhm.
so it's okay to go back and try again too, though. And it is absolutely okay. And and I think you should say, that I actually feel really offended by that, or something like that. Or um, I'm religion sometimes comes into it, and any therapist, really, regardless of their religion or beliefs, should be able to work with anybody, because it's not
Mhm.
about our beliefs or our ideas at all. It's about where the client's at.
Mhm.
But sometimes it might be like somebody mentioned something that felt more from a religious place, and so that can feel offensive to some people or whatever. It's absolutely okay to give the therapist feedback, and you should.
Mhm.
That's important. And then there's sometimes where maybe you're just not sure if you kind of vibe with somebody, or you just don't really have a sense yet, not negative, not positive, or you don't necessarily feel a connection. Maybe you give it a few times. Some people are really great. Some therapists are going to have those skills where they can just provide a space where it can feel easier for people to connect. And some, maybe that might not be their greatest strength, which doesn't mean they're not a good therapist. That just might not be their super strong point, right? So it might take a little more time.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Because I know it took some time. I don't know how many visits it was. I always tell people like give it at least 6 times, give it a try, unless it's like really horrible. It-
Right.
but what's really horrible, I can't. That's going to be different for everybody. And then
Yeah.
certainly like I can speak to like the level of, I guess I would call it neutrality, like because you talked about like differences in beliefs and whatever and how it shouldn't really matter. I know there was certainly times where I unloaded on you. And I can remember actually coming in and being like, yeah, so last week, I'm really sorry about that. And you're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But where I know I said some pretty shitty things because it was just out of frustration and whatever. It didn't really, but you weren't like, well, fuck you, get out of my office. Like it was very much just like you just maintain composure, which is like definitely a superpower for sure. Because when somebody's unloading on you at times, it can be fairly abrasive and hurtful, even though really I was directing it at you, but it probably wasn't really about you. It was my frustrations about everything else.
Yeah.
And so like that level of just being neutral is really there
Yeah.
with health professionals because it, you can't sit here and be like, well, you know what the solution is? You need to go to church. You need to do this. You need to like that's not what it's about. Your purpose is very much as I understand it. Um, you know how to ask the right questions that will allow me to come up with the right answers that I'm after.
Yep. I'm just helping you know how to get to know yourself, and learn how to learn how to actively work through stuff that
Mm,
you just haven't quite figured out is your way yet. Yes. Yes. And that, because any of us, I don't know about anybody else, but if somebody came to me and they're like, okay, you need to do this and you just need to try to do this differently, it actually really pisses me off, because
mm,
I feel judged, almost like you're telling me I suck at all this.
yeah.
Which is not my stance, and I'm a very strengths based therapist where I truly see everybody from their strengths, and I see the struggles as just attempts to cope and survive, and the result of these other things that have happened in our life, right? That we just need help figuring out
Mm.
about ourselves and how and what we want to do with that, you know? So, and sure, we're human. So there are times we call it countertransference when there might be something with something a client says or particular mannerism or something that we notice internally that we have some sort of strong reaction to.
Mm.
And that's our job to recognize and not let that um, become any sort of bias or influence the way that we would interact with or relate to our clients. That's us for us to figure out. This is about me. This is about
Mm.
my client. Sure, something they said or a mannerism or something is bringing something up, but that's not about them. That's about me.
Yeah.
And it is our job just to be there and be neutral. And sometimes people will apologize for swearing. If anybody knows me, I swear like a sailor. So I'm always like, you can say whatever you want, but even if I didn't swear, it's very important to me that clients can come in and be themselves.
Yep.
And if they themselves, they're major swears, or they just need to unload and they're pissed and they're saying things that later they're gonna be like, I can't believe I said that. That I'm not in there to judge. In fact, I'm happy when they're doing that because that means they're releasing a lot of stuff they've been holding in.
Mm.
And where better to release it than to a place where you're safe and you don't have a personal relationship with this person that is going to complicate things, and you can just unload.
Yeah.
Which I've done plenty of times in my own therapy. I just went to unload.
Yep. And,
Yeah.
and it definitely happens. Like I know when I'm doing it, and I've come to understand that's just how things work, and
Mhm.
it's okay, and it actually is a good thing because it allows me to get closer to what I'm after every
Yes.
time. And I think it's important too because sometimes, like you said, that's just what you went there for, was just to unload.
Yes.
Sometimes in life that's just what it is you need that space to be able to just be open and just let it all come out. Where if I were to do that to my kids or my partner or a coworker, there's going to be a very different reaction. And it's
With a lot
not,
of wounds, right? A lot,
yes,
because
and
sometimes
lasting
we just need to
consequences.
vent and say some really nasty things, even though that's not truly what we mean.
Mhm.
We're trying to release pressure, and it would cause a lot of harm to these important people in our life if that were to come out at them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And that's what it's there for. And that's why it is important, I think, too, to be able to be comfortable enough to do that.
Yes. It's actually imperative, because if you feel like you have to come in and kind of mask yourself, make sure you're presenting in a certain way or whatever, you're not going to be able to get the healing that you need, because none of us can do that where we're trying to present as something different.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
in which case I try to bring my authentic self in as well. Because I think that that is part of building a safe environment where somebody feels like this person's real. And if they're real, it's okay for me to be real.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's huge because we are, I think, as humans, especially at this day and age, we are attracted to authenticity
Yes.
because there's so little of it in the world. So when we
Yeah,
see it, it stands out. It's
it
just
does.
sticks out so much. And
And we're
so
drawn to it.
yes, we
Yes.
very much are because it's so
Yes.
rare. So when we see that authenticity, we bring our authenticity to wherever we're at. That allows us to better connect with whoever it is and to be able to be comfortable to talk about those things and be open and vulnerable.
Yes. We also um sense, and sometimes we're more aware of this than others, but we also sense when somebody is not being authentic,
Mm.
because our brain is always there to protect us. So it's always aware of what's happening around us. It picks up every single piece of information in our environment. It
Mm.
chooses what to send forward to our conscious mind, but it picks up everything.
Mm.
So it might not send something forward until it kind of sends this feeling that something's off or something. And that's our brain's way of recognizing that there is something different in this person or situation than what is being presented. And it makes us uncomfortable. The same way that I'm also an equine therapist, the same way that if you try to approach a horse as well as anything but your authentic self, they will be on alert, and they will most likely not run from you necessarily unless you're aggressive, but they'll kind of just turn and trot away because it's uncomfortable. They can tell that something is not as it seems. And since they're prey animals, then that's dangerous. They're not going to stick around and find out what it is, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And we can do that as humans too. And so, and authenticity is important. That's how we develop real connections.
Yep, absolutely. And that's key to all this. It's so important. And I think through the connections, certainly for me, that's allowed me to heal and to get to a spot now where I'm willing to I actually really enjoy doing this podcast and talking to people and helping people to develop plans of treatment and like what's going to work for them, and kind of help guide them along the way, because I feel like it would have helped me to maybe be a little bit more comfortable going into it. And for some people it isn't. Some people I'll talk to once and they're like, yeah, I'm good. I'll let you know if I need anything. And other people I've maintained, lasting conversations with as they're going through their journey and working on things, which is really cool to see, because the goal in all this is just to help people. Is to just let's help people who are struggling to get better and to even thrive. Because I would certainly say when I first met you, I was certainly not thriving. I
think you were barely surviving.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there was no desire, no will to do anything. And looking back now, like, I'm so thankful for all the work, because had I not put in any of that work, I wouldn't have ever enjoyed life again, or maybe even would have ceased to live. And because of the continued effort, I've gotten to this point where I'm like, no, I wake up every day and I love life and I'm happy and I enjoy it. And I throw so much stuff into my day where even you ask me, like, is this sustainable? Is you getting up at 3:30 in the morning to go work out sustainable? How long are you going to do that? I'm like, I'm just going to keep doing it. But because it now works for me, and it
does, which we talked about, because for some people, you're setting yourself up for failure if you pick something that really isn't sustainable. But for you, as we talk about it, it's actually absolutely sustainable. So
I mean,
even you're thriving with it, actually.
Yeah. And because you had even asked about sleep, and I'm like, well, I'm trying to go to bed by 9. And sometimes it's 9:15, 9:30, but usually I'm in bed a little bit before 9, unwinding. And you're like, oh, so that's like 6.5 hours. That's actually pretty good for you, because when we started,
I was blown away.
I wouldn't sleep for days.
I was blown away, man. That's so significant for where we started, where you even had to drink yourself to get to sleep, right?
Yeah.
Like, then you got, like, I don't know, 3 hours of sleep. That was huge.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you put it in that perspective, that was for you. You were like, okay, yeah, I believe you. It's sustainable.
Yeah. We're totally good. Yeah.
And it's become just such an integral part of me now to be able to do that and jumpstart my day. And sure, there's mornings the alarm clock goes off. I'm like, oh, crap, I don't have to get up. But I'm always happy that I did, because I've committed to it, and I just tell myself I get to do it, which is also a mindset shift that I had to get to.
Yes.
Where I always initially felt like I have to go to treatment. I have to go to this appointment. I have to do this. And all these things were just, I had to, not that I want to, not that I get to. But now I very much try to frame it as I get to do this. I get to go spend an hour sitting in an office with you and working on myself. I get to do that. There's people who don't do that, and they're eating themselves alive because they aren't doing it, because they don't want it.
You've described the difference between surviving and thriving, right?
Yes.
And anybody that's coming to me in the beginning, or getting help from anybody in the beginning, they're at survival. And there is no, at that point, trying to tell yourself, I want to do this, I get to do this, feels more like the toxic positivity than actually being able to do some shift in your thinking. because
Mhm.
that is literally not where you're at. And so it's okay to be like, I have to do this.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you're like, I have to do this to survive.
Yep.
And that's the awesomeness of the healing part. Then it starts to become, I get to do this.
Mhm.
I can do this because I have the ability to do this, which makes us also appreciate it. And it feels really good to thrive, right?
Yep. Yep. I
Yes.
look forward to the appointments, and even where my ketamine treatments are so far spread out now because I've been doing them for so long. But I still look forward to them because I know
Mhm.
it puts me in this space for several hours where I'm just very much in my own head, but in a positive way. Because the
Yes.
purpose of those treatments was never to, we're going to give you some ketamine and I want you to just sit here and think about all these horrible things.
Right.
Um, uh, Colby was very much adamant, like, don't think about those things. Just sit here and think about what you want to be, who you want to become, where you, what you want out of life, how you want
Yeah.
your life to be, your existence to be. And so going into it with those intentions
Yes.
of what you want versus all this horrible shit bag of luggage that you're carrying around.
And you'll still
Now,
do the processing and the healing
yep.
because your brain's like, this is what I want. And it's thinking through that.
Mm,
It's then also got the freedom now to think about, what do I have? And how do I get to what I want? And it'll bring in these little things that are just processing these little pieces of kind of the how did I get to this point, even though they're not this direct replay of these traumatic events, right?
yeah.
Yes.
And
Yes. So you'll
very,
still get
very
there.
seldom did anything traumatic ever come in
Yeah.
during a treatment. There would be things that I processed that were kind of weird, like the death of a loved one who hadn't died yet, who
Uh-huh.
still hasn't died. And you're like, well, that was weird. How do you process? But for whatever that was, that that was needed apparently.
Yes.
And so all of that in that space just allows you to internalize and grow. And then knowing the next day I'm going to come sit with you and talk about it and start to integrate those things. I very much look forward to that now. Where
Yeah.
initially it was still, even with the new treatment, with going from EMDR to ketamine, it still felt like a have to
Yeah.
because of the space I was in. But once you really start to see the traction, at least for me, and covering some ground, then it very much, it's like, okay, well, we've been crawling for a while. Let's start walking now. And now I feel like I'm running. And I love it because I like the accelerated pace of it, but I love seeing what I'm gaining as I work towards the things. And even now, knowing that I still experience traumatic events at work,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, they they might bug me for an afternoon, they might bug me for a day, but it's not like it used to be where it would just wreck me for weeks. Like I don't,
Yeah.
and my brain still tries to make that shift, like my old school way of thinking, where you deal with that and you're like, I just want to go home and have a couple drinks. But then
Yes.
instantly the new brain kicks in and it's like, why? Like, what about that makes you want to have drinks? And then you're like, well, I don't know. Like, what? Okay, well, but if you don't know, then why? And then uh what's the benefit of it? And you're like, well, it'll help me relax. Well, will it help me relax? Are you going to really sleep better because of it? Or are you going to wake up in the morning and feel like crap? Or like, do you
Right.
want to feel depleted? Do you want whatever? And now, very much, if I drink, it's a very social thing. And it's like, hey, I had 2 drinks over a 6 hour period.
Yep.
And it's not this drink to get drunk to try to cope. And and because the new brain, as I call it, has allowed me to think that way. I mean, that was how I quit using tobacco too, was I was just like, one day I was just like, why am I doing this? Because I never, like, there's been a lot of years that I just never really wanted to do it. Like I felt like I
Mhm.
shouldn't do it. It's bad. Like nobody smokes cigarettes and thinks they're healthy for
Right.
it. And the same with anything, right? And so with the chewing tobacco, I just one day was just asked myself, like, why am I doing this? And I told myself, I said, well, I'm doing it because I'm stressed. I said, well, what's stressing you out? And my response immediately was, the source of my stress I'm no longer attached to. Like is no longer there. And very much where it was my ex-wife that was the source of my stress, or at least that's what I thought it was. Whether it
Mhm.
was or not, I don't really know, but that's what I associated with. Where now, like, I was just like, okay, well, I'm not married to her anymore. I'm not stressed. I don't need it. And I just walked away from it. And even at that, I'm very much able to work with her in a very friendly way to deal with the
Mhm.
kids and all those interactions, and we work together great now. So somewhere that new brain has kicked in, and I still don't know exactly what all it's done. I just know that it's changed things.
It is. And what you described, you have a hard call and you're gonna feel it that day, maybe even the next day, maybe even a couple days, but it doesn't get stuck in the loop.
Mhm.
And that's because your brain is processing it. That's what you're feeling. You have to feel to heal. You're just processing that call. You're processing the feelings of distress. You're processing um, these aches in your body that are randomly there and you probably don't even realize are connected to the trauma, but we do. Trauma stored in our body just like it is in our brain. And your brain's actually just processing all of this and integrating it and not getting stuck, which is
Mhm.
why it moves on and you can keep going. And yes, once a tool for coping is in our toolbox, it is always in our toolbox. So if drinking was a tool, or um, suicide ideation, so those thoughts or that, that urge to commit suicide, once it was activated as a tool, it will always be there. And our brain, when we're feeling extreme distress, will always be like, I got the big boys here. We got this covered. We're good. Like it's pulling
Mhm.
out, overkill, right?
Yeah.
Um, because it knows that that one works. That one, like, oh, drinking alcohol, that works. Um, but then because you've done so much processing and healing, this other part of your brain is like, yes, and it talks you through these things at the same time that you are processing the trauma, and you work through it and you move forward, right?
Yeah.
And that is healing versus getting stuck in those loops.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's a cool thing. It's a cool thing to see because for a while it was just happening. I don't know that I really recognized it. I think, well, I know you recognized it because you're like, wow, that's really good. And I'm just like, yeah, whatever. Like, yeah, okay. But once I finally started seeing it, that no, I very much made this conscious choice to deal with it this way, where the old me would have dealt with it this way and
Yeah.
not a positive way.
Yes. And you say the new brain,
Hmm.
literally, when we are creating a new behavioral response or a new pattern, a new habit, new routine, new learning, we are literally creating a new pathway in our brain.
Yep.
We are developing a new neural connection.
Yep.
And just like if we're trying to make a path in a field, create a new path, we're going to have to walk on that path hundreds of times
Hmm.
before it actually becomes a dirt path that the weeds kind of don't grow on anymore.
Yep.
The same thing has to happen in our brain. And that is why change is so difficult,
Hmm.
because it takes so much work and so much repetition for it to become a really strong neural connection in our brain. And from there, our brain is most likely to pick the most used, the strongest path. So as we are now using this new brain, as you call it, this new path, the other one's atrophying a little bit. It's
Hmm.
still going to be there. Just
Yep.
like once you learn how to ride a bike, you always know how to ride a bike. Might struggle for a minute, but it's there. So
Yep.
it's still going to be there, but we're probably going to take the road most traveled. Though our brain will pop up the option, hey, you're at an intersection. You can do this or you can do this.
Hmm.
And it's going to throw in the big guns because it's trying to protect us. But we still then have the control to make a choice.
Hmm.
So, yes, there is a new brain. You've made new neural connections, given yourself new pathways.
Yep. Yep. Which was a big part of, like, I didn't recognize it with the work that we were doing initially. And it
Uh-huh.
wasn't until we really kind of delved into the ketamine and they talked about how the neuroplasticity that it causes in the brain and allows these new neural pathways to form more
Yes.
easily. And it's
Yes.
still a fascinating thing because I don't know that there anybody's really 100% on exactly why it does that, the ketamine, why it actually causes that. but it does, and the science and the
Yeah.
research has shown that it does, and that it kind of accelerates that. And
Yes.
that was when I really realized, after doing the ketamine for a while, that no, like everything we had done up to that point was doing the same thing, just in a different way. And then even
Yes.
breath work, meditation, anything else that you do, any other modality is going to do the same thing.
Right. Those aha moments that you have, those, when I did a breath work session a few months back, and had the most incredible healing. I don't even know if you call them aha so much as just, I don't know, an opening up something. But I mean, that's literally like, oh, look, it's just formed a new connection. It
Mm,
now knows this can now attach to this, right? Versus this. And that's literally what's happening. And you're right. If we were just to do like cognitive processing, trauma cognitive processing, that means we're just talking through the traumatic incident without any of these other modalities included. It will still, you will still get the same healing, but it takes much, much longer.
mm,
EMDR accelerates the healing process. Hypnotherapy, in my experiences, really accelerates the healing process, as does ketamine. And I think the unique things about hypnotherapy and ketamine, both of them, hypnotherapy is getting yourself, you get the client into a deep trance state, never really asleep, can't make them do anything, nor would I want to.
mm,
But it's actually, I mean, literally, there's a frequency, a brain wave that we get to when we're in that trance state. And it's kind of like our conscious brain that does all the overthinking and the analyzing. It's like it, in this case, with hypnotherapy, with ketamine, it's like it kind of, I don't know, sends that one off for a break so that we can communicate more directly with the subconscious mind, and versus almost this middleman process, right? And I think that's why it can accelerate it even so much more quickly, because we don't even need to have the relay anymore,
yeah,
which in these other forms, I mean, we're still able to process, but because maybe it's chilling out these other parts of our brain, they're not getting activated, we can just really make this process more streamlined.
mm,
And it is incredible.
yeah, it
It is
really is.
incredible. And EMDR I've seen be just as incredible. They're all different and it
Mm,
looks different, but I have seen some of the most amazing, literally at calm transformations, to
mm,
see people from where they were at and just everything about them, their countenance, their energy, all the emotions, everything, to then when you've fully processed these traumatic things, it's just, it's like it's all different. Everything, their energy is different, their whole essence or being is different. It's almost calmer, softer, lighter. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's
yeah,
incredible.
yeah,
Incredible.
yeah. And I've talked to people who did EMDR, and that was very much their outcome. That, they, for them, it didn't take very many sessions. They maybe just had like the one trauma that they needed to specifically work on. But even um, one of them, they told me, like, just after the first session, left the office, and it was like, the sky is beautiful and I love life. Like, everything was
Yes.
open to them. And then after the other like 5 sessions that they did, like, they felt whole and complete, and everything was great.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and
And
so it very much worked for them, and
yes.
effectively.
Yes. And it does. I mean, you're right. The complexity of the trauma, you definitely, complex PTSD is not an official recognized diagnosis, but we recognize that
Mm,
it exists, right? Whether there's a code for it or not. Um, and when you work in emergency services or have been in the military, sometimes not even within the combat zone specifically, um, or you grew up in a really abusive household or something, I mean, there is so much complexity to the trauma that it is going to take a lot longer to work through. And that makes sense, right? A discrete trauma, meaning it has a very specific beginning, middle, and end, are
mm,
going to be the most, you're going to be able to work through the most quickly,
mm,
which makes sense. There, it's not as complicated. Doesn't mean
mm,
less traumatic, just not as complicated. And when there's somebody that has pretty severe trauma, and we're opening up with EMDR what we would call a target. So whatever we're focusing on processing. Sometimes, and I tell clients this, that after the first session of a target is when they're going to feel the most raw. And all I can say is raw, because everybody comes back to me with different experiences. Some will be like, I felt fine that day, but the next day I just like kept crying and I had no idea why I was crying. Or I felt super, super sleepy. Or I just felt kind of on edge or irritable, or it's different. But it's kind of like saying we just opened up, we literally just created a crack in the dam on purpose. That's scary for people, of course. And so a lot comes flooding out in that first session. And so it feels heavy. Yep. And so I always try to I caution people that, and to say, please, 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 even if every part of you does not want to come back to therapy again, because that was so difficult to feel, please come back, because the last thing I want to do is open all that up and then it's too hard to come back. And then we've just left it, this gaping wound, right? If somebody comes back, I'm not going to force them to keep processing something, because that's just going to re-victimize them. It's really important when you're working with trauma that the client is in control of the process. If somebody says, Heather, I can't do it today, awesome. We're just going to work on other stuff. We'll talk about other stuff. We'll just work on things that help them build them back up. But it is, and it does happen. Sometimes we open it up and people, I don't see them again, which doesn't make me mad at them or anything. You know, I feel sad and worried that they're kind of walking around with a giant wound. But I also understand it. And so that sometimes it takes more courage to come the second time and the third time than it did even the first time.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it too, like you usually tried to advise me, like again, you never tell me what to do or anybody what to do, but very much tried to steer me into like taking some time to process before I jumped right back into life, which was really difficult for me because I always I was very OCD, obsessive compulsive, to where I was like, no, I have to get home. I have to make dinner. I have to clean the house. I have to get the laundry going. I have to make sure the kids' homework is done. I have to take care of all the animals, feed the chickens, the cows, get the eggs, the dogs, and everything has to just be taken care of. I
mean, yeah, it took us like 5 years to get to the point where you're like, self-care, right? Oh, maybe I can do that. What?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of times when you asked what I was doing for self-care, and I was like, I like drinking, you know, which is like just such an ass thing to say, but that's where I was at. Like that was like
that was your only tool at that point, right? That's what you had left.
And as bad as it was, and even, you know, once we kind of started to get to where I could do it, like I just told myself one day, because you were like, even if you just like, if there's a soda or a drink, you like, just go get it at the gas station and drive around town and drink it, and just windows down, listen to music, whatever. And that was really hard for me. And one day I left your office and I just started driving south, and I forget what I was even intending to do, but I was just like, I'm gonna go drive. I think there was maybe like a house or something that I wanted to look at or something, but I just kind of got deep in thought, and all of a sudden I come to and I'm an hour south in Ogden. And I'm like, okay, like conscious that I'm driving the whole time, but not really thinking about where I'm going or anything, but just like, okay, I'm getting on the interstate and I'm heading south. And that was kind of one of the first times that it was just like, oh, like I just essentially ended up taking 2 hours to myself to just go drive. And then I was like, well, yeah, completely. I mean, I was like, well, I'm in Ogden and I'm remodeling the kitchen. I need some flooring. So I ended up like going and getting flooring. Wasn't even on my list.
Gotta still make this purposeful. Can't push myself that far. Yeah.
But in the end, that hour was just like, it was different than what I had been doing. And it was very much where I was so deep in thought that nothing else around me mattered. I was on autopilot, which in a way is kind of scary, because I'm just drove 60 miles south. But but
with very little conscious recognition of it. But
yeah,
yes, that happens to all of us. But
yeah, but I mean that happens like on long car rides and things. So
yes,
but that kind of was the aha moment for me, where well then it was like, okay, like there is some value to this. Like, well, what is it that I'm gonna do? Because I'm not gonna drive to Ogden after I see it every time,
right,
you know.
right.
Um, but once I kind of started figuring that out, or that I would, very purposefully go do something for me, that like if there's something that I wanted to go look at a store, or even it didn't matter what it was. Sometimes it was just there's a house that I want to go look at, or whatever it happened to be, or I'm just gonna go drive here, I'm gonna go for a walk, whatever it is. And once I started kind of figuring that out, now I don't even, just this last week I kind of have made this shift where I'm not really considering it self-care anymore. It's self-investment, because while the self-care, it is a real thing, but I had heard the term self-investment, and I liked it because it's literally what you're doing. You're investing in yourself instead of just
Yes,
pouring out everything you have for everybody else, which was what I was doing when I told you. I was like,
yes,
self-care? I don't have time for that shit.
yeah, literally, that's
Got
what you
all
said.
these things to do. I mean, yeah, that's what I said. And to where that was just me pouring out what I didn't even have to pour out for
Yes,
everybody
yes,
else. And now recognizing that, no, by investing in myself, I'm truly making myself whole. And then when my cup overflows, that fills everybody else's cup.
yes.
And
That
that's the
is
way
what
it
we want everyone to
needs to
learn.
happen. Yeah. And it's a
It's very
hard
hard though.
thing.
Yes, and most people feel like that's selfish, and maybe part of that's the culture that, well, probably very much is this capitalistic culture that we live in. Um but that's exactly how it needs to work.
Mm.
We have to fill up our own cup, and what we give to everybody else is the overflow. And I
Yep.
like the self investment. And maybe there are times when this feels like self care
Mm.
because I'm doing anything I can to even get out of this resource deficit I'm in. And sometimes it can feel more like self investment, where, well, now I'm just adding resources and I'm just banking them, right? Both need to be intentional, need to be intentional. Self care, self investment as is just as vital as sleeping, eating, and drinking water.
Mm.
Just as vital. If we don't do that, we literally don't survive. We don't live.
Yep.
We have heart attacks. We commit suicide. Um, any of those things happen, right? So
Yes.
yes, and it can be a hard concept to learn. OCD was a coping mechanism.
Mm.
You had OCD, keep going, and even though you weren't thinking of it, keep going and just try to keep life going. That's my goal, because I'm on survival mode. I just have to keep it going, because if it doesn't go, I'm done.
Yep.
And drink was the only option you had left, because there was no energy for anything else.
Yep.
And drinking helped.
Yep.
Right? It helped. It had a lot of other consequences maybe that weren't awesome with it, but it helped.
Yep.
And as you were able to get some healing, it meant you had more resources to devote to self, uh oh my gosh, I just lost the word. Self, not improvement, the one you said.
Investment.
Investment. Self investment. When you started to then have more resources to devote to something different than just surviving, then you could channel those into um your own needs.
Yeah.
Invest in yourself, right?
Yeah.
And really, I mean, look at the dad that you can now be for your kids. That, I mean, you are always a good dad, and you are always on top of making sure that your kids' needs were met. And now you can be that same dad, but you also have these awesome relationships with your kids,
And when I
right?
didn't have the emotional capacity before,
Yes.
I would blow up on them and lash out at them, which made them want to just not be around me.
Yeah.
And now very much, yeah, the relationships are awesome, where we have the deeper connection, and we're able to joke around and do things and talk, and even to where I'm sharing like the importance of mental health with them, because like I anyone can look back at when they were in like junior high and high school, or even just how it is hard being a kid. Like kids get picked on,
Yes.
things happen. And then nowadays it's got to be 100 times worse with social
Yes.
media and phones and everything else. So very much I love the fact that I'm able to have that connection with them now and to share things with them. And and it is funny though, because they'll look at me sideways like I looked at you sideways about some of the things that we tried.
Uh-huh.
And but then they're young enough that they're like, okay, no, dad's not messing around, like he's actually serious. And like we try it and like, oh, okay, you know. So
Right.
it's to be able to share those tools with them is huge too.
That they
And
don't have to wait
relationship.
until they're struggling and suffering for somebody to teach these, to even show them these tools exist, that they have a dad who's able to teach them these now in like a proactive way.
Yeah.
And this circles us all the way back to attachment trauma.
Mhm.
Before, they had a dad who was doing his very best, and really, you are a good dad, and you were a good dad then too. But you also had a really short fuse, right?
Very
And
short.
so what that can develop with kids is an anxious attachment, because they kind of have to, they start to feel the mood every time dad comes home or every time they come in the house. They're kind
Mm.
of feeling the mood, and this can be with either parent. Um, so, or they might walk on eggshells or something like that. This, you can't create a secure attachment when you don't have a safe environment. And I don't just mean physically safe, but like emotionally safe, or where you can count on some sort of consistency in terms of response from your parents. Even when they're doing the very best they can, right? It's still going to have an impact. Now, because of the healing you've done and the work you've done and the tools that you have and all the growth that you have in your life, you have this environment that you're offering with your kids, and you're really good at it. I mean, really you are.
Thanks.
That is giving them some seriously awesome opportunities to develop this secure attachment style. Um, and so not only is this something that has been like, this work has impacted you and made so much change in your life, but it is literally going to change generations of your life.
Thanks. Pretty awesome when you put it that way, because like I would have never thought that that was what I was doing as I started this out. And I am very proud of like the work that I've put into the kids, but never had I thought of just even like beyond my kids where that goes. But that even to me puts out more out there why it's so important
Yes.
for people to get their mental health right, and to really dig deep and do the work even when they don't want to, and to learn to thrive, because it affects so many people around us. Like I never really thought I affected anybody else initially. Like, yeah, I'd lash out at people, but I found a way to like place that blame as I was doing
Mm-hmm.
it on them, on the kids, on Karen, on my ex-wife, like on whoever,
Yeah.
versus eventually recognizing that no, I'm just lashing out and it's not their fault, but I'm lashing out at them, which then makes you feel like shit, because
Sure. Yeah.
you're hurting them and dragging them into your bullshit that you've got to figure out and deal with, to further transition into not lashing out on them. Or at least when I did initially, I started to recognize it, and then I'd stop myself and just like, I'm so
Yes.
sorry. Like this is not acceptable behavior from me. Like I lashed out, I lost my cool. And and what I really need to say to you is this, instead of acting that way, and I will work harder on that, to where now it just is seamless, where it just, we have the exchanges, and there is no lash out. Like if I have to lash out, it's going to have to be a pretty big situation where like I need to stop the kids from trying to stab each other with knives, big, right?
Right. Right.
Like
Right.
something significant, because I don't feel a need to deal with anything that way. Like I don't lose my cool like that anymore. And
Yes.
and that right there, they, because they were scared of me, just that behavior shift, and then the time for them to learn to trust that I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just saying that I was making that shift, but for them to
Yeah.
actually see like, no, dad actually made that change, and it's sticking. That's where that's where that relationship and bond grew, and where the
Yes.
trust came in. And you know, and I do think, like everybody out there, you're doing the best you can with the tools you have.
Yes.
And certainly so many of them are the tools that you were taught as a child. And those were from your parents that were also doing the best they could with the tools that
Yes.
their parents gave them. And so I do see that very much. And I think that it puts that much more importance on really getting yourself into just tip top mental health, so you can be the person you want to be, to love your life and to thrive, but also to be able to teach your children and your loved ones how to do the same, to be that example to them, to where it just comes naturally.
Yes. Yes. And there was something important that you said in there to say to everybody who's listening, watching, that um man, if you have messed up with your kids, they're not ruined for life. They are
Yep.
not ruined for life. And even if they're adults now, there can still be healing in that relationship, and you can still start to develop a secure attachment with them. Because Dan, you totally outlined it. Repair attempts, right?
Mm,
We are all doing the best we can in any given moment with what we've got.
mm,
And it's not fair to judge ourselves by looking backwards, because what we've got now is different than what we had then, right? Including the knowledge and awareness. It's about what we do afterwards. Exactly what you described doing. Recognizing it, saying, whoa, this is how I responded. That is not okay. I'm not okay with that. I'm going to keep working on that. Here's how I want to respond. That's a repair attempt.
mm.
That tells your kids or your partner or somebody you work with, whoever you lost it on or whatever happened, that tells them, I hear you. I recognize how how I um how I act can impact you. And if it did impact them negatively, I see how that impacted you. I want to be able to do things different. It's important to me to do things different. And here's what I'm working on doing differently. Right? Man, people feel seen, they feel heard, and so much healing just with those things goes into it. Right?
Yep.
And so, everybody out there who right now is feeling this parental guilt, like you've ruined your kids, and because maybe you're not in the place that Dan has been able to get to. I don't even think I'm in the place that Dan's been able to get to, in terms of just how well that he can parent. Um, it, it it's not lost, and it's never too late. Just like it's never too late to get treatment.
Yep.
Whatever that is for you, whatever works. So I
Yeah.
love that you have all these different people on that show all these different things, because it's also giving people tools um, to pick and choose from that they might not have even known existed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the point of this, is like just to get it out there through that authentic way, and to also, because the just being honest with not only ourselves but with others about our mental health. And that's
Yes.
not that you need to go tell everybody that you're
No.
suffering from some traumatic event or anything, but once I became comfortable even just talking to my kids about it, then they kind of had a better understanding of why I would go from this roller coaster of emotions. And even to my coworkers, because
Yeah.
God, that was a conversation I didn't want to freaking have.
No.
Um,
No.
but it was also important because it allowed them to recognize that it was okay, and that it was okay to go get help for anything that they were suffering from as well. Um, but I think, you know, uh we've gone on a long time and I could keep
Yeah.
going.
Yes.
I This has been such a great conversation. I'm so appreciative that you came on. I may have to have you come back on, and we'll maybe try to hone in on like talking about some other specifics that people are interested in.
Sure.
Um, but if people wanted to reach out to you, or if they wanted to get some more information or anything, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. Yes. So my business is called Thrive Wellness Services. Um, I work in a building with a group of other therapists that we're all associates. It gives us some people to bounce things off of. It's a good thing. our building name, our group is called North Logan Therapy Associates. Our website, which you can find me on, is northlogantherapy.com. And my email, you can reach me by email, is holsen, that's Olsen with an E, .lcsw@gmail.com. And on our website, you can find our office number. You can also find us on Psychology Today. I have some awesome people that work for me as well, who I have a lot of confidence in. It's important to me that that if people are coming to me, that I provide the best that I can. So that there are a few of us available. So.
Right. Perfect. And I will put that in the show notes too, just so it's in an easy format for anybody who didn't get that written down. And then just final question for you, Heather. What would you say to somebody that is in the space where they don't think they can keep going? They're in this dark space of trauma or depression, any of these things, and they just feel like they can't go on any further, or they're on the fence about getting treatment. What would you say to them?
I would say that they are already showing how incredibly strong they are, because they're still alive. They're still surviving. And that I know, and I've seen it. I've been a therapist now. I graduated with my master's degree in 2009. And I have seen just how much healing can happen for people. I have seen things be able to shift and change and get better. People that have gone from maybe even suicide attempts, or just having thoughts of suicide all the time, to being able to go to this place where they feel some happiness and some joy in life, where they feel this ability to be and do whatever they want to do. It's terrifying and it's scary. But I know that it can make a difference.
Thank you for that. That's great.
Yes.
And I think that is very true. It certainly resonates with me. And thank you again for coming on, Heather. I appreciate you so much. I always enjoy talking to you, especially in this format where we can just not so much worry about me, but just use me as an example, but talk about things on such a broader scale. And I truly am appreciative of that. Thank you so much. And again, guys, if there's anything Heather can help you with, reach out to her. She is an amazing resource. And I'd love to have you back on and fine tune, talk about some other stuff that would be relevant.
Absolutely.
And go from there. But guys, thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on another episode of Free Your Mind podcast. Thanks again for tuning in, and love you guys. God bless.